now we get to, thanks. Jacob and Fabienne and some other folks are doing this separate quantitative review. I think they will at some point have more to say about how big this literature is as a whole. I actually don't have an estimate of that. I think it's probably tens of thousands of papers. Okay. Most of these studies take place in the United States of America. Those that do not typically are in Europe. A couple are in, one's in Canada, one's in Australia, but we're talking about like a Western world research literature. They come in a lot of flavors. They have like leaflets, or some have videos. These can include documentaries. About 16 out of 60 of these interventions are actually at a university cafeteria or a restaurant or something like that. About half of them were online, and a little more than half, sorry, a little less than half are with university students. And over here on the right, this is an example of the kind of pamphlet or leaflet that you would typically get if you get a leaflet. Okay, most data in this literature is self-reported, for better or worse. There's no standard self-report measure here. I just finished another meta-analysis on programs to prevent sexual violence, and there's like a very standard dependent variable that comes up hundreds of times, and that makes cross-study comparisons very straightforward. Not the case here. So like, for instance, you might have a diet journal that asks you, did you eat egg in the past days? Did you eat meat in the past 7 days? And then some of those studies are simply a yes, no, I did or I didn't. And some of them are like, how often did you? And one of them is, how many grams do you think of meat do you think you ate? Which, like, I don't think I could estimate of any food I eat, but that is what we have. And then there are some that basically ask like a random subset. So on these days, did you eat meat? Or at dinner, did you eat meat? And the other category of outcome is objective stuff. For instance, Jalil et al., Joshua Tasoff is on this call, track students over 3 years at a cafeteria, at their college dining halls, and other places like other interventions are taking place at a cafeteria, and then they just measure how much meat did you sell on treatment days, how much meat did you sell on control days, and the difference is the outcome. So as I said, this literature is huge and it's theoretically very diverse. But these interventions basically take like one of 3 approaches. They can do nudge stuff. They can try to change the way meat is presented. They can try to make you think that eating vegetarian meals is the normatively desirable thing to do, or they can try to persuade you that you should eat less meat. And those typically come in one of 3 flavors: animal welfare, health, and the environment. Okay. The question of what is a nudge is actually kind of tricky to pin down. I'm sure some of you have dealt with this problem, but basically we go with this like canonical definition, which is it's about the choice architecture. It can't forbid anything. It can't alter your economic incentives. It has to be cheap and easy to avoid. And also, it can't imply like social sanction. It can't be like all the good people are doing this other thing, because that's affected, like, we all fear exile. So for us, that counts as like non-nudge, even if it's like very subtle. Here are some examples in the Voshki et al., please, I hope I'm saying that name correctly, study. These are the spoons that people at a Stanford cafeteria use to serve meat. And the treatment is, the control is the spoon on the left. The first treatment is the spoon to its right, and the second treatment is the spoon to its right. Basically, just give people a smaller spoon to serve meat with and see how much meat they serve. This thing on the right, I'm sure you cannot read this, but basically it's a cafeteria bulletin board in Sweden, I think, where they just put the vegetarian meal at the top at eye level or not. So these literatures, it's not like some secret genius plan. It's like pretty obvious stuff, like that just changes like little things about how food is presented to you. I was quite taken aback by this literature, by some of its like what I would call glaring methodological deficiencies. Um, so the most common is that they only ask people what they would eat in some hypothetical land. And I know that this lab does some of that work, so I'm open to it, I want to say, but like for me, if that has any predictive validity for map consumption, that needs to be demonstrated rather than assumed. So like I think of this research as like step one, like a generating hypotheses towards the stuff we actually want to know. Many of them are also, as I said earlier, they have like 1 day in treatment and 1 in control, or there's no random assignment. And I think that this has a lot to do with university partners and stuff. Like cafeterias don't want to have a different menu every single day. That puts a lot of burden on staff. But the effect is that most studies do not meet our 10 clusters randomly assigned criteria. And then there are some serious threats to internal validity. And also people have said that this literature has some publication bias issues. And I don't mean to harp on this, but in my opinion, this is already a finding. Like a lot of people have said that choice architecture interventions are very effective at reducing map consumption, and I don't buy it. And this is, I think, like an important point of dispute. So for instance, we had someone in the lab look at this previous meta-analysis, Mertens et al. 2022, that said choice architecture interventions are especially effective at changing eating habits. When we looked at that, it was a lot of hypothetical outcomes, a lot of cross-sectional studies, and then a couple studies where they served kids more vegetables and then saw how many vegetables they ate, which again is like not really possibly going to have anything but direct effects in one direction. So anyway, I'm a skeptic of this literature. Norms. Okay, I like this literature. It's very interesting, and I didn't know anything about it before I started this project. Basically, they take a somewhat indirect approach, which is that they try to change how you think about people who eat meat. The one that I really like, this one at the beginning, basically they tell people that people who eat meat score higher in social dominance, which is this thing that like endorse hierarchy more. So basically they try to make people who eat meat seem to be counter-normative. Now, for what it's worth, like 95% of Americans eat meat. So I guess I could buy that they score higher than vegetarians, but it's definitely not like, it is by definition normal because most people eat meat. So I don't know what to make of that. And then ones just basically say like 95% of people say that the veggie burger tastes good, just saying like people like this food. This literature also has its own interesting theoretical preoccupations. There are many different kinds of norm. Descriptive norms basically just tell you, this is how much meat people eat, this is where you are, or this is how many people are vegetarian. An injunctive norm adds an element of approval or disapproval. So in Alblas et al., if you report that you eat more meat than the average Dutch person, they give you a frowny face. And if you eat less meat, they give you a smiley face. Then there's static norms, which are just like very similar to descriptive, but basically this is a contrast to dynamic norms. They say like this many people are trying to cut back on their meat. And then there's dynamic, which is this many people are starting to cut back on their meat, are like have changed their behavior or will change their behavior. And the idea is that dynamic norms induce pre-conformity. Like you see where those people are going and you yourself want to get there. So I want to talk here about like a landmark study. I'm going to do this twice. These are the studies that I think if you had to read anything in this literature, I would start with like this study and the other. So Sparkman et al., Greg Sparkman, These are 4 dynamic norm interventions. They all take place around Stanford. And this sign here, which is at the Axe and Palm Cafe, it says, "We've noticed customers are starting to choose more meatless dishes." Notice the starting to choose. That's what makes it a dynamic norm. It's like it's happening, not it happened or it's static. Here's what they find. They run 4 studies in 4 places all around the Bay Area. First, they all are basically that kind of intervention, like a dynamic norm placed somewhere on the menu. The first one increased vegetarian sales. The second one also increased vegetarian sales, but the virtual restaurant abruptly closed 10 days into the study. So that study didn't really work. The third one at lunch at this restaurant in Palo Alto increased vegetarian sales. And then at dinner, it decreased vegetarian sales. There was a reactance effect or a backlash effect. Okay, on to persuasion. So this is probably the bulk of the literature in terms of how many studies there are. The first category of persuasion literature is appealing to animal welfare. We saw earlier that leaflet where the cute pig looks unhappy. That's pretty typical for the animal welfare appeals. They come through leaflets or videos or documentaries, and they often are from materials from animal welfare organizations. I'm not going to go over this very much because I assume most of you probably know what I'm talking about. Okay, appeals to health are aimed at things like cardiovascular health or weight loss or cancer prevention. A lot of these studies are targeted at people who are already at elevated risk. So there's like a couple studies out in MGH in Massachusetts that look at that enroll people who are at elevated risk for colorectal cancer and give them about 10 things they should do. And one of them, for instance, is eat less red meat. That incidentally is one reason why many of these studies do not meet our main data set, because they might be eating less red meat, but we don't know what else they're eating. I'm not sure if perhaps I should have said this already. The thing about the red meat studies is we don't have any data on substitution effects, so we don't know what the impact is on MAP consumption overall. Also, when I read these studies, I think the phrase social desirability bias keeps popping up in mind. Like this quote from this study, Bernsen and Vanderplicht, this bolding that I did, this is not mine. This is like in the text itself. They are trying to get you to think about the prevalence of heart and vascular diseases and BSE, which can even result in death. And then 3 weeks later, they ask you, how much red meat did you eat? And so, what would you say? Okay. Then we have appeals to the environment. Most of these are aimed at climate change, but there are some other environmental harms. But for the most part, just think we're talking about like the effects of cattle on carbon emissions. I've included a visual from a study that we actually don't include in our main data set. So take a look. This is at the University of Virginia, and it's a thing that shows up on your menu where more sustainable dishes are given more leaves. So if you get pad thai with chicken, get 4 leaves. Pad thai with tofu, congratulations, you get 5 leaves. The thing about this ranking, why we didn't include it, is that you can substitute from the nude sampler with pork to pad thai with chicken, and you're going up. You're like doing better. But that's just substituting from one MAP product to another. So from our point of view, we don't know if that's good or bad. It depends on many things. Okay, now I want to talk about the second landmark study. Jalil et al., this is in Nature Food. It was published last year. I really recommend this study. It's a quick read. I think it's called like a quick low-cost intervention can lead to sustainable changes in dining habits or something like that. And they give, basically, my impression is someone, probably Andrew or Josh, gave a 50-minute lecture in place of a standard econ in an lecture in the intro econ class about why meat consumption contributes to global warming and is bad for your health. And then the really great thing about the study is they tracked what people ate at their dining hall for 3 years. That's a huge measurement lift, and it really puts the study like way above the median study in this literature. And they find overall a 5.6% reduction in consumption. The thing is, the study has two theoretical perspectives underneath it. There's appeals to the environment and appeals to health. And what's doing what? I don't really know. And I also have some questions about where this study will replicate. Like, are the students at Penn State or wherever, are they similar to students at Occidental or where whatever liberal arts college this took place at? I don't know. Like, I'd like to see that because I'm interested in seeing how far this goes. Okay. Now we're gonna go into the quantitative results, but can I stop here and ask if anyone has any questions about the theories? Okay, I shall continue. Okay, so this is a meta-analysis. I don't know if everyone has read meta-analyses before, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how you should interpret them. Basically, there's a two-step algorithm. The first is you need to be able to compare things on the same scale. So what you do is you standardize them by the standard deviation of the outcome. So every study gets expressed as units of change of units of standard of deviation of change. So if the treatment group scores, 5 on a outcome and the control group scores 6 and the standard deviation is 1, then the standardized mean difference is 6 minus 5 divided by 1 is 1. And you just put all of these things into this scale, and then you compare which is the biggest. That's part 1. Part 2 is, I guess it's really a 3-step process. You give it a variance based on how precisely that's estimated. And that basically amounts to larger studies get smaller variances. Then you average all those things together in a way that gives more weight to the more precise estimates. And that's meta-analysis. Okay, also want to give some context for how big are different effect sizes. I mean, it really depends on the nature of on how much variance there is in the dependent variable. But basically for Jalil et al., a 5.6% reduction comes out to a Glasses delta, that's our symbol for standardized mean difference, of 0.11. And for this other one, where people in the treatment group ate meat and or eggs 2 times more per day than they did before, and people in the control group ate meat and or eggs 0.5 times more than they did in the control group, that means there was a backlash effect. That comes out to a backlash of negative 0.259. I mean, it's hard to know how to interpret standardized mean differences in terms of real world effects. Basically, we're talking about small changes equal small deltas. Okay, drum roll, results. We find nothing. We find an overall estimate of 0.0204 without a significant, not that I place too much stock in statistical significance, but basically this is the overall effect is nothing. That's going to be surprising to a lot of you, I suspect. But if you actually read these papers, most of them say the results were not significant. Now, for what it's worth, they don't necessarily say it that baldly. They might say, we found significant effects for people who were high in pre-conformity values or something. They'll present some subgroup for which there was effects, but then say the overall effect was nothing. That's a pretty common move in this literature. We don't find any evidence of publication bias. But I wasn't expecting to, considering that the vast majority of these studies describe themselves as null. Yeah, so again, this is probably a surprise. If you look at previous meta-analyses, including one by Mathur et al., you'll see that they say there were effects. So what gives? That's a complicated question. I don't have a clear answer. basically, I think that most of it comes down to the fact that we look at math consumption, and previous meta-analysis look at a wider variety of dependent variables. So like, if you look at the 10 biggest studies in Mathur et al., which they helpfully provide for us in a list, 9 assess in like intentional outcomes, and then the 10th is not a randomized control trial. So right away, we're like already removing most of the highest performing studies in that literature. By contrast, there's a pretty, like what social scientists would consider a small effect on red and processed meat consumption, but it's real. It's like a fifth of a standard deviation, which if you're very sick, might be a big deal. Like you might not, if you're at risk for colorectal cancer, just cutting back a little bit might be enough to like seriously reduce your risk. So from the point of view of health, this could be very good. From the point of view of environment, red and processed meat is the most damaging category in terms of like carbon emissions. So that's good too. But again, we don't know what people are eating instead. And because of the small body problem, which is that you have to, if you eat like a box of chicken wings, you're like 1/4 of the way there to killing a chicken, whereas a cow provides like 2,400 quarter pounders. This could be bad. And Maya has made this point in a separate article. Okay. Now I want to do results by different approaches. The bottom line finding here is most of these results are really, really small, as you see. The one exception is nudges, as you see, but nudges is 2 studies. So we could be describing the effect of nudges, or we could be describing the effect of studies that take place in Sweden, which both of these studies do, or that have some person as their first co-author, which they both do. So basically the tagline result is none of these results look very durable. I would say the same for like, if we look at different kinds of ways that a study can be, like intervention can be delivered to you, the internet doesn't look too good. A pamphlet looks downright bad, like counterproductive on average. Videos, not so good. Place-based, like a little better. That's like things that take place in a cafeteria or whatever. And then everything else, which is just a catch-all, I guess, looks better. Here's something I found quite disappointing. On average, most materials from advocacy organizations are extremely ineffective to the point of producing minor backlashes. Those negative signs mean little backlash. Now, admittedly, these are tiny effects, so I wouldn't like worry too much about it, except for the one from the Humane League. That's actually a problem. But for the most part, we're basically saying that if you think these are like very good animal outreach organizations, and the direct advocacy work they've been doing that we evaluated does not come out looking very effective. I want to stop and say here that I think a lot of these organizations have changed gears a bit and are working now on like corporate campaigns and other things. I wonder if this is in reaction to these results. I can't speak to that. I think other people on this call actually might know more about that. Okay, back to the country results. A whole lot of small numbers, and the larger numbers, like in Canada or Sweden or worldwide, are just a few studies. Actually, the worldwide is like 1 paper and 5 studies within it, so, or 2 papers. I don't know what to make of that. What I'm trying to say is I don't place a lot of credence in any theoretical thing by this. I don't think these interventions work best in this place. Like, I think we don't know the answer to that. Then we have who is getting tested. Once again, I wouldn't place too much credence in any of this. Studies with young women seem to do pretty well. Studies with university students seem to do not so well. Adults is also a hard category. And here I'm defining adults as like older than college students. Okay, here's something surprising and good. Some people wonder about whether the prevalence of open science practices, which I'm here defining as, do you have a pre-analysis plan or are your data open? Will that drive effect sizes downwards because they cut down on questionable research practices? That does not appear to be going on here. In fact, the opposite. You find that people who have open data plans or pre-analysis plans actually find larger results on average. And this is for our norms scholars. Dynamic norms are about 6 times as effective as descriptive norms, but none of these effects are especially large. Where do we go from here? We're now in like the last third of the talk. I can probably talk for 10 minutes and then ask for questions, or stop here at all. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I have one. Can you elaborate on the weighting of studies? Like, were studies with non-self-reported outcomes, like the Jalil study, also weighted more?
No, that's a great question, and I wish we could do this. This is something I want to talk to Maya about later. Like, meta-analysis does not incorporate information like that. It just takes the precision as number of units. You can then do what I did, which is like separate them out into 2 different groups, but effectively the amount of weight that I give these studies is not the same, like in my model of the world, is not the same as the meta-analysis. So for the most part, these are our meta-analytic estimates are not quality dependent.
Thank you.
Jacob.
Yeah.
Hey, Seth. I was curious on the table for the different advocacy organizations. And I think as you sort of described, yeah, a lot of these organizations have moved away from doing any of this. But I was curious, is this classified based on the study author or the actual author of the contents that the study was? Does that make sense?
I should have clarified this. This is the materials from an advocacy organization, not is the author herself from an advocacy organization. Like yours, like 2 studies by you in which you reanalyze data, I think on behalf of Fauna-Lytics or the Humane League are here. But I guess you were employed by them at the time. Anyway, it's a mixture, but the intention is materials by.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Any others?
Yeah, Seth, I was curious. You mentioned that some of the red and processed meat consumption studies are pretty strong in their design. Are there any kind of clever modes of outcome data collection that you think could be used in the context we're more interested in? Like, have they figured out kind of good ways to collect hard outcome measures that is, relatively cheap and scalable?
No. These are almost all self-reported stuff. Like the best study in this literature, I think, is by Carfora. They're strong on design, like they have interesting ideas. I wouldn't say that their measurement is sophisticated. It's like get texted for 3 weeks about why you should eat less red meat according to some pledge you signed. And then they ask you 3 weeks after that, did you eat less red meat? Okay, I'm gonna keep rolling through. Okay, what is the point of a meta-analysis is a question I've been asking myself a lot while writing this one. There's this previous paper I like that argues there's basically 4 things that a literature review can do. You can assess the current state of knowledge, build theory, direct future research, and do policy. So let's go through these one at a time. In my opinion, the core thing that this literature has not tackled successfully is speciesism. Like getting people to just accept the premise that it is not okay to discriminate based on species. And I would say that many of these studies work in the other way. Like a lot of the studies in the red meat group that we didn't include actively do encourage people to switch to fish or chicken. So this is a really hard problem, but let me say here that like if there was some intervention that reliably tackled this problem, you'd already know about it. It would be front page news. So this is not like a big surprise. It just sucks. A core measurement challenge here is about substitution. Like when people stop eating red meat, what do they eat instead? Or in the nudge literature, if you get them to eat less meat at lunch, what do they do at dinner? That's a good example because Voschke et al. Tackle this very nicely. They're like, you can measure this question. It's just that the studies in our literature do not. Voschke is a quasi-experimental study and it's after our deadline. I would just say that the upside of that is that we're at the birth of like a new literature here, like a new academic field. So if you get this stuff right, like if you meet these simple criteria, which are not honestly not that stringent, you can like increase our body of work by a lot. So, you know, we've got some good low-hanging fruit to pick. And if you're doing a power calculation, your minimum detectable effect should be tiny. Like a lot of these papers say, we are powered to detect a Cohen's-d of 0.5, but I wanted to say like down by a factor of 10, and you'll be closer. Okay. Regarding theory, not all of these outcomes are the same theoretically. Like, if I ask you to cut back on your meat consumption because of animal welfare reasons, it doesn't really make sense to say like, just cut back by 5%. Like I wouldn't say child abuse is wrong, so you should only do it on the weekends. Like if it's wrong, it's wrong. And that's why these animal welfare appeals seem to me to be better connected to going vegetarian or vegan, in which case you probably need to sample like tens of thousands of people if you're going to convince someone, because it's very hard to convince someone to become vegetarian or vegan. Like my own process was many years. And second, if you're going to do health and the environment appeals, it's really easy to make the case for red and processed meat reductions. It's a little harder to say like, and you shouldn't eat chicken and fish because you can like just watch the gradient go down in terms of emissions and health. But Jalil et al. Have threaded this needle very effectively by you have to like keep emphasizing that like the best thing you can do is tofu or nuts or whatever. And here's a question I have that I don't really feel like is well answered in this literature. I want to know more about how people think about their own meat consumption. And I want to think about this particularly with regards to nudges and norms. Like if I do something very subtle in your dining hall that changes how meat is served, do you notice it? And if you do notice it, do you think like, oh, well, I'm below my weekly meat budget, I'm going to have more later. And if that's the case, then we should expect regression to the mean. And if it's not, if every meal is in isolation, or if people don't notice this stuff at all, then maybe you're good. I think this is an empirical question, and I'd like to see some more like qualitative research on it. And lastly, I would say, we've talked a lot about effect sizes that are like 5%, 3%, 2%, and that's all well and good. Like a 2% reduction at the scale of the US Army would be a lot of animals saved. But at the scale of a liberal arts college, it's kind of nothing in this. I mean, it's not nothing, obviously, like that cow was going to care, but it's a small drop in a big pond. So if you're going to have small effects, that's fine. I personally want to know, like, what's the plan for getting big? Okay, the part I'm really excited about, future studies. There are a lot that occurred to me while I was writing this paper, because there's just not that much out there when you look at these high quality stuff. And a lot of very good theories have not been tested in this, like according to these pretty minimal standards of rigor. So a lot of room to grow here. And also a lot of institutions that have yet to be sampled. Like there's one study where people just watch the movie Babe and then have a discussion about it. The actor who played the farmer in Babe became vegan after participating in the movie. Maybe that'll happen to people who watch it. I don't know. Or just repeat Jalil et al., but do it someplace where we haven't tested these kind of studies before, like a retirement home. The other one is, can we like fight back directly against a kind of American machismo idea that red meat and meat in general is really necessary for power athletes, by like pointing to other athletes around the world who do amazing things? Maybe. Like, again, if you can scale up to something to the size of the US Army, you've got a good intervention going. I also noticed that there's almost nothing in our literature that tests directly experimentally the elasticity of demand with respect to price of meat substitutes. So like I just read this article in the LA Times about Beyond, who basically said their CEO said like, our customers are not that price sensitive, so we don't worry about this. But it's like, yeah, dude, that's your current customers. But what about the people what if you're trying to grow? Like, does it actually matter? I'd like to see some more work on this question. And then last but not least, there's this whole literature, which Maya alluded to briefly, on how intergroup contact can change minds. And there's like some stuff on like contact with cute baby farm animals, but nothing that's that actually measures meat consumption directly a couple days after. So could we like do a farm sanctuary visit as part of college orientation or something like that? I don't have much on the policy front. I think this literature is not quite ready to like be scaled up to policy, and also who's going to do it? I mean, it's a tough moment for that kind of thing. But my first thing is I want to know more about scope conditions in which nudges and norms work. So I think we should be trying them, like basically repeating current studies in more places. And I think if you want to protect people's health and focus on the environment, I think it's probably a good bet to focus on red and processed meat consumption. And I would say that overall, none of the animal advocacy materials that we looked at are ready to be scaled up yet, and that pamphlets in general seem to backfire as often as they seem to work. Dean, questions?
Thank you, Seth. That was fascinating.
Thanks.
Martin, go ahead.
Hi, Martin.
Well, hello, Seth. Thank you. That was very interesting. So I should probably indicate that I'm an
Martin, I think
I'm an
you're
outlier.
muted maybe. We're having
I hear
audio
Martin.
problems. We can't hear you.
I hear him.
I'm unmuted, I
Well,
think.
Martin, we still can't hear you.
Jessica, that's on your end. I think I hear him fine.
I also hear him.
Hello, hello, hello. Can you?
You're good.
Okay. Okay. Well, for those who can hear me, thank you very much. I'm a bit of an outlier here since I'm not particularly mathematically or statistically oriented. But I've worked a lot with qualitative, as it were, arguments as a book publisher on veganism and animal rights for many years. And I wondered, Seth, if you could perhaps give me a sense of whether you feel that the studies that you looked at were using language in their definitions of what was being requested or analyzed in terms of restriction, replacement, reduction. In other words, having to change something, having to remove something that you found pleasurable, or having to reduce the thing that you found pleasurable, and whether that may have changed the way people perceived their the way they responded to those studies. That's the first question. Then beyond that, you've obviously drawn an indication that you have a conflict of values. If, for instance, you are concerned about the environment, you may reduce greenhouse gas emissions by not eating cows, but you harm more chickens by eating them. So you've got a conflict of values between whether you think the climate issue is more important than animal welfare, and whether there are any studies you see in which you talk about maybe a value interrelated added benefits, such as the ending of factory farming, which of course will help in many different sectors. So just those two questions. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so the first one, there's one study that comes to mind which compares eliminate and reduce op-eds. And I believe that it finds that the reduce language is more effective at getting results. It's an interesting thing. This gets to the theory building part. Like if I ask someone to eliminate and they say like, I'm not ready to do that, I guess it's an open question whether they then will reduce like a little bit. They're like, I can't eliminate, but I'll do this other thing. My memory of this one study is that they don't do anything, so it's better just to ask to reduce. But in general, most studies in this literature are about reduction, not elimination. But I'm going to make a little note. I'm going to follow that up in the theory building category. And the second, can you say the second question again? I lost my thread.
Value interrelatedness.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
So in other words, instead of saying if you stop eating meat, if you stop eating beef, you can reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. Say if you stop buying your food from factory farming, you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, improve animal welfare, support small farmers, increase biodiversity, reduce environmental pollution, save water, help restore public lands, those kinds of things. Has that been analyzed as well? I would say the other thing, the difference between elimination and reduction, is if people asked, have you tried to expand your diet? And have you tried to bring on new foods, new combinations of foods? Did you know there are 246 types of bean in West Africa? These kinds of questions that expand palettes as opposed to reducing. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking. Thanks.
Yeah. The truth is that I am familiar with a very small subset of this literature, and it's huge, and nothing that I can remember looking at asked these questions, because I also don't recall any studies that say you should switch from, you should only buy meat that is not from a factory farm. There are a couple studies that actively encourage people in Norway to eat this roach patty, which is a terrible name, but it's apparently this fish that's causing eutrophication in the Baltic Sea or something. And so they actively say eat this fish, you're doing good for the environment when you do it. So I guess that's values interrelatedness, but not really, because also that's not map reduction, that's redirecting. So nothing that I've looked at meets these criteria, but with the caveat that I've really only cornered a very small portion of this market. Louise? Or
Hi,
Anna?
Seth. Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I thought the presentation was really good. I guess what I was wondering is how, whether you have a sense for how these results relate to other related results in the literature in particular. So when thinking about other interventions to reduce consumption of certain kinds of products, for example, I don't know, saturated fat or sugar, stuff like this. And then on the other hand, maybe thinking about non-food interventions with an ethical purpose. I don't know, getting people to donate more money to charity or these kinds of interventions.
Yeah, I read a couple papers like that, because when you start getting into, a couple papers are saying, here's 10 ways you can reduce your emissions. You can turn your lights off at night, or you can cut back on your meat consumption. So there's a couple things that place this into context. My off-the-cuff remark is that when I actually took a look at a lot of this literature in this little subfield, I found there was less than meets the eye. It was weaker than I would have thought. And I hypothesize that the same thing is going to be true for that other literature where they try to get people to do other stuff, but I cannot say that definitely about that.
Oh, thanks.
Anna?
Yeah, I was curious if any of these studies involved alt protein, and in general, what your thoughts are on alt protein as an intervention.
I think it's wonderful. Carfora et al. 2022. I can't remember the name offhand, sorry. Make a month worth of meat-free substitutes available to people as part of their intervention. So yes, one study in this literature does that, and they find some pretty good effects. But that's the largest effect in the whole literature, but they do 4 things, one of which is making, I guess it's impossible meat or something available to people. But in general, this seems an underexplored topic. So if we were coming up with new research ideas, one of them would be a subscription to Rancho Gordo, the great bean thing, they're like, they send you like subscription beans along with recipes or something like that. Like that kind of stuff is comparatively untested. But I guess it's not really a meat, it's a substitute, but not in the way you're thinking, I think.
Yeah, I guess I'm also interested in differences between different types of substitutes, like Beyond and Impossible versus just like tofu and beans. If
No,
they're yeah.
we got to figure that out. There's probably work on that somewhere, but none of it meeting, again, pretty basic standards of rigor.
Thanks.
But that's your opportunity.
I have another one, Seth. So I'm curious, in the studies that were not college students, do you have some gestalt sense of how sort of self-selected the participants were, in the sense of being people who already wanted to reduce milk consumption, and then perhaps they signed up for this, getting sent meat substitutes, and so they were sort of already interested, and maybe what we're getting is a genuine treatment effect, but it's a treatment effect among a relatively sort of already motivated group. Do you have a sense of how often that happened?
Not in a systematic way. I can come up with some examples where people, like there's one of the phonolytic studies asks people, can you help us? It's like advertised to people like, can you help Phonolytics with its materials on the Phonolytics Facebook page? So yes, I would think that's recruitment. And a lot of the health studies are definitely aimed at people who, even if they don't want to cut back in their meat consumption, are being told they have to. But it's a good question. How would I even like phrase this question? Like recruitment effects or something. Recruitment effects among the general population. I don't know. Good follow-up. Among Gen Pop. I know.
Yeah, I was curious if, well, I have two questions. One is, are there other problems like smoking cessation or recycling, or buying EVs that you think could be relevant as a source of ideas? And I was also curious if you had any thoughts on best practices for increasing validity of online experiments that involve selecting from a menu. Like I've seen some that involve a lottery in which some people actually get the meal. So if you had any thoughts on that.
I can't keep two things in my head today. Can you say the first question one more time?
Yeah, I was curious if you think
Oh, yeah,
that
other literature. Sorry,
like smoking cessation could be a source of inspiration.
Okay. If I were trying, what do I think actually works? I don't know. I think the nudge literature is probably like, we can look at things that nudge people in other literatures and borrow from them. So I just finished this other meta-analysis on sexual violence prevention programs. One of the points we make in that is that like when a college student enters a dorm room, what furniture is there? Is it like just a bed? In which case, when you have someone over to talk, is it just the bed that you sit on? Like things like this are an under-considered like avenue. So I would say that probably like the one that comes to mind is like just that there's a lot of nudge stuff, a lot of choice architecture stuff that we haven't really fully explored. And as to online stuff, I do think I like the idea of a lottery. My idea was that your compensation can just be like a coupon to Chipotle, and then you only get compensated if you mail in your receipt, so you can see exactly what people ate. I don't know how that works with IRBs and stuff, but like something like that. I think there's a way to like make sure there's a dependent variable at the end of it that is consumption. Josh? Sorry.
Yeah, thanks for this talk. Super interesting. This is more of a comment because I see, a lot of what looks like, very youthful people looking for, probably in grad school looking for potential projects to work on. And I think the point that you made about there's a low-hanging fruit here is, I think that's an excellent point. And in economics, you know, there's this old joke, like we don't look at the important, it's like the drunk guy who lost his keys, you know, you don't look where the keys are, you look where under the light post, because that's where you could see things. And usually that's kind of problematic, but here, I think in this field, we need to be looking under the light post more, actually. So it's like, actually a good way to think of starting a project is like, where can I get good data? Like, forget about like the coolest intervention, like more like, where do I get lots and lots of data, like tens of thousands of, like knowing what I know now, I need tens of thousands of observations or huge effects, because it's really hard to get effects in this area. So thinking about how now the kind of the disappointing thing here is that also setting up those kind of relationships with an organization that could supply you with you know their administrative data could take a lot of time. It's like a great time to get started early in your PhD, but probably not late in your PhD. And you know the payout is quite delayed, like when you finally get to run that study. So you know, if you get started now, you know, maybe it's not ready for your portfolio when you're on the job market, or maybe it's when you're after you do your postdoc or something. You know, it's something to consider. It does take time usually when you're trying to look for those institutional partners. But yeah, really interesting presentation. Really cool results. Thanks a lot.
Of course. When did your nature food study begin?
Yeah, this took us a really long time. I can't remember actually when we started. It took many years. I was on calls with other co-authors, year after year, trying to come up with something where we could get lots of data, you know, good data, good project that we could actually do. Literally, we would have like weekly or maybe bi-weekly calls with the founders of Animal Charity Evaluators back when it was very small, and we would have these weekly call, you know, maybe monthly calls. And we went years without actually coming up with a project that we thought we could launch. And then we ended up doing a lab experiment, and then it just so happened that we got really lucky because, you know, I went to actually multiple colleges looking for whether they would have that, the kind of data that we could actually, you know, track people. And most of them didn't. And then we got really lucky because, you know, I'm not supposed to say this, but, you know, it was at Andy's institution, and don't tell anybody. But well, then Andy had it. Andy had the data, so he could get the data. So there's yeah, so it took a long time. It took a long time to kind of find that, and a lot of like dead ends. Yeah. So many years. It took many years.
Yeah.
Multiple years to start a project.
Yeah, and the payoff is you have a really great paper. So I don't know. Like,
yeah. So it's but you're grad students, so you could kind of focus. I mean, we were going slow too, so you could go much faster than we did.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful. A really, really great discussion and a really great talk. So thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. And I put in the chat our link to our seminar series. If you're not already on our mailing list, please add yourself. And we look forward to continuing this conversation in other ways in future months. Thank you all.
Thank you, Seth.
thank you, everybody.